This is the family embarrassment we all have to deal with. At my son's wedding, his new wife introduced me to her wealthy parents. Everyone laughed until her father stared at me and gasped, "Aren't you the secret multi-millionaire who bought my company? I'm glad you're here. If you're watching this video, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're hearing my story of revenge. I want to know how far it's gone. My name is Emily Turner, but most people just call me Emily. I've spent the last 15 years perfecting the art of being strategically invisible, which turned out to be great preparation for what was coming. My son Dylan had been dating Jessica for 8 months, and I had only seen her twice before today. 2 brief encounters where she asked me very direct questions about my modest lifestyle and whether I might need help with my expenses as I got older. The wedding was spectacular. I have to admit that the Reynolds estate stretched for more than 50 acres in the rolling hills of Virginia, with a private chapel that could hold 300 people and gardens that must have cost millions of dollars. Jessica walked down the aisle in a dress that probably cost more than what most people earn in a year. And Dylan looked happier than I had seen him since his father passed away. I chose my own outfit very carefully. A simple navy blue dress from a nice department store paired with my grandmother's pearl necklace. Nothing flashy, nothing that would draw attention. I learned a long time ago that the key to privacy is to look exactly like what people expect to see. A widow living comfortably but modestly on an engineer's pension and her late husband's life insurance. The ceremony was beautiful, though I couldn't help but notice how Jessica's mother, Paula, was sizing me up like I was a piece of furniture that didn't quite match the decor. But the reception was where everything changed. The Reynolds family spared no expense. Ice sculptures, a 12-piece orchestra, and enough flowers to open a floral shop. I was at a table in the corner watching my 32-year-old son dance with his new wife when Jessica approached with her parents. "Mom, Dad," she said with that sickly, sweet tone that sets your teeth on edge, "I want you to meet Dylan's mother." And then she said the words that changed everything. Robert Reynolds's eyes locked onto my face with a look of recognition that made my stomach turn. "Emily Turner," he murmured, and just like that, I was no longer invisible. "Wait, aren't you the woman from the Reynolds Holdings acquisition board 3 years ago? Aren't you that mysterious investor who bought my company?" Robert Reynolds' words cut through the noise of the reception like a knife through silk. Color drained from Jessica's face as she looked back and forth between her father and me, her look of superiority replaced by pure confusion. Paula Reynolds's diamond bracelet sparkled as she brought a hand to her neck, and I could almost hear the gears turning in her socialite mind. Truth is, most people don't know what real wealth looks like. They expect diamonds and designer clothes, luxury cars, and flashy displays. They don't expect a woman in a simple but elegant dress who shops at normal stores and drives a reliable sedan. That's exactly what I've counted on for the last 15 years. It all started with an invention by my late husband, Thomas. A small piece of technology that revolutionized the efficiency of cell phone batteries. We were both engineers, Thomas and I working for a tech company in Austin in the early 2000s. When Thomas developed his power management system in 2010, we thought we might be able to retire comfortably. We never imagined we were sitting on a gold mine. The patent was sold in 2012 for $25 million. Dylan was 24 at the time, fresh out of his master's program in marketing, full of dreams of building his own career. That same day, Thomas and I made a decision that would shape the next 13 years of our lives. We told Dylan we had received a nice payout, enough to be comfortable, but nothing extravagant. He never questioned it. He Probably assumed it was $1 million or $2 million at most. What Dylan didn't know was that the $25 million was just the beginning. Thomas and I took that money and began to invest it systematically. First in conservative stocks, then in growth companies as we learned the market, real estate in emerging areas, tech startups with solid foundations. Thomas had a gift for spotting undervalued opportunities before anyone else. By the time he passed away 5 years ago in 2020, our portfolio was worth over $800 million. $800 million, the same amount I used to acquire Reynolds Holdings 2 years after Thomas's death. The irony was delicious. While Jessica was looking down on me and asking if I needed help managing my finances, I had been the anonymous investor who saved her father's company from ruin. The same company he almost destroyed with his reckless ambition and poor debt management, forcing him to sell to what he thought was a corporate investment firm. That firm was a shell company, controlled by me. I bought Reynolds Holdings not for revenge, but because its core business was solid despite Robert's mismanagement. It had a good structure, strong client relationships, and talented employees. Under proper financial supervision, it thrived again. The man whose daughter had just called me the family's embarrassment had been living off my business decisions for the last 3 years. "I'm sorry," I said in a low voice, looking directly at Robert. "I think you're confusing me with someone else." But we both knew he wasn't. I could see the memory in his eyes of that boardroom meeting where I sat silently while my lawyers handled the negotiations. Back then, he barely spoke to me, assuming I was just someone's wife there as a formality. Now, as Jessica stared at us with growing alarm, I realized my carefully guarded privacy was about to become a very big problem. The next morning, I was in my cozy apartment sipping coffee from my favorite mug, watching Dylan pace back and forth in my living room like a caged animal. He had called me at 7 a.m. demanding answers I wasn't ready to give. I hadn't slept a wink. My mind kept replaying Robert Reynolds' face when he recognized me and the panic I saw in Jessica's eyes. "Mom, you have to help me understand what happened last night," Dylan said, running his hands through his hair like a frustrated kid. "Robert Reynolds pulled me aside after you left. He asked me some very specific questions about Dad's patents and your investment activities. I had quietly slipped out after Robert's revelation, claiming I was tired. The truth was, I needed time to think. 15 years of carefully protected privacy had crumbled in a single moment, and I didn't know how to handle the fallout. Dylan was different from his father. While Thomas was methodical and strategic, Dylan was direct and emotional. "What kind of questions?" I asked, though I could already guess. "He wanted to know about Dad's tech patents, about whether you were involved in major business deals, about our family's real financial situation." Dylan stopped pacing and stared at me with those serious brown eyes he'd inherited from Thomas. "Mom, he seemed to think you were some kind of major investor." It was weird. Suddenly, my coffee tasted bitter. This was the conversation I had been both expecting and dreading. Dylan had built his career as a senior marketing manager. Through his own talent and hard work, he had earned his place at a respected company, bought his house with years of savings, and lived modestly because he thought those were the values Thomas and I had taught him. How could I explain that while he worked 60-hour weeks for a raise, I could have bought his entire company without even noticing it in my budget? That while he saved for his down payment, I was managing a portfolio worth more than a small country? "Dylan, sit down," I said gently. "We need to talk." But before I could continue, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Jessica. "Emily, I think we should have lunch today. There are some things Dylan and I want to discuss with you." I showed the message to Dylan, watching his face shift from confusion to concern. "What do you think she wants to talk about?" he asked. I had a pretty good idea. Jessica Reynolds was not the type to leave things unresolved, especially when money was involved. She had probably spent all night grilling her father about his suspicions, and now she was ready to dig deeper. Question was, how much had Robert really figured out from that one brief meeting 3 years ago? Think I said cautiously that, "Your wife is a lot smarter than we've given her credit for." Just then, Dylan's phone rang. Jessica's name flashed on the screen. He answered, and I could hear her voice bright and artificially cheerful. "Dylan, honey, I was hoping we could all have lunch today. There are some family matters I'd love to discuss with your mom now that we're officially family." When he hung up, Dylan looked at me with the same expression he used to have as a teenager when he suspected I knew more than I was letting on. "Mom, is there something you need to tell me about our family's finances?" Outside my window, I watched the familiar rhythm of people heading to work. People with normal worries about meetings and deadlines. I envied that simplicity. "Everything," I finally said. "I need to tell you everything." Jessica had arrived at the restaurant 45 minutes early. She was already seated at a corner table when Dylan and I walked in. She had picked the most expensive place in the city, I noted, and had chosen a table with the best view. Her blonde hair was perfect, and she wore a designer suit I'd recently seen in a magazine. "Emily, Dylan, thank you so much for coming," she said, standing to hug us. Her smile was radiant, but I caught calculating look in her green eyes as she scanned my simple black dress and understated jewelry. I ordered a bottle of nice wine to celebrate us being a family. It was a Bordeaux that cost nearly $1,000. Clearly, Jessica was setting the tone. "That's lovely, dear," I said as I sat down. "Though perhaps a bit much for a casual family lunch, don't you think?" "Oh, I don't think there's anything casual about our family anymore," she replied, her smile never faltering. "Last night I had a long chat with Daddy about his business experiences. He told me some fascinating stories about corporate acquisitions and anonymous investors." Dylan looked between us, sensing a tension he couldn't quite place. "Jessica, what does that have to do with this lunch?" She ignored him completely, her focus entirely on me. "You know, Emily, I studied business at Wharton. I love everything about corporate finance, especially complex investment structures and shell companies. Dad mentioned that when they bought Reynolds Holdings, the buyer acted with surprising discretion." I took a sip of wine and waited. I wanted her to make the first move. "The funny thing about discreet investors," she continued, "is that they usually have very good reasons for their privacy. Generally, it's related to large fortunes they prefer to keep out of the public eye." "That sounds reasonable," I responded calmly. Jessica leaned forward slightly, adopting the tone of someone about to share a juicy piece of gossip. "Dad said the woman at the acquisition meeting was quiet, elegant, and seemed to leave everything to her lawyers, but he felt she had the presence of someone used to making important decisions." Dylan was now staring at me as if things were starting to click into place. "Mom." Before I could say anything, Jessica took out her phone and showed us a photo. It was a news article from 3 years ago about the purchase of Reynolds Holdings with a small picture from the signing. There, half hidden between lawyers and executives, was a woman in a navy blue dress, her face barely visible. "The image quality isn't the best," Jessica commented casually. "But the woman's posture, her height, even the way she's holding her purse. It's incredibly similar to you, Emily." The silence stretched on as Dylan studied the photo, a spark of recognition dawning in his expression. I had to admire Jessica's homework, but at the same time I felt the walls of privacy I had so carefully built begin to crumble. What a curious coincidence, I finally said. Right? Jessica's smile now had a sharp edge to it. Of course, coincidences happen all the time, like my family's financial problems starting. Just when someone paid nearly $700 million for my dad's company. Or like that mysterious investor completely disappearing after the acquisition, almost as if she preferred to stay. Anonymous. Dylan put his wine glass down with a trembling hand. Mom, tell me you're not who she thinks you are. I looked at my son, the young man I had raised to value honesty and integrity above all else, and I knew that 15 years of well-intentioned lies were finally catching up to me. Dylan, there are things about your father's patents and our investments that I never told you. Jessica's triumph was written all over her perfectly composed face. But as I watched her savor what she clearly believed was her victory, I wondered if she had any idea what she had just unleashed. 3 days later, I was in my financial advisor's downtown office watching James Sullivan review the documents I'd requested. The lunch with Dylan and Jessica had ended with my son storming out in anger after I confirmed his worst fears and with his new wife making veiled comments about family financial planning. Now I needed to understand exactly what I was up against. Emily, I have to say this is an unusual quest, James said, adjusting his glasses as he looked over the financial profile of the Reynolds family. What's with this sudden interest in your daughter-in-law's family history? I had called James the morning after our disastrous lunch and asked for a full workup on the Reynolds' current financial situation. What I was discovering was far more complicated than I imagined. I didn't realize that when I bought Reynolds Holdings, I was essentially acquiring my future daughter-in-law's inheritance. James raised his eyebrows. Your daughter-in-law, the one who just married Dylan? When I nodded, he let out a low whistle. That's complicated. Tell me something I don't know. He pulled up several files on his computer. Okay, let's go over this. In 2021, Reynolds Holdings was struggling to make payments on the expansion loans they took out in 2019. Robert Reynolds had over-leveraged the company, buying up smaller competitors, and when the economy tightened, they couldn't handle the debt. I remembered that acquisition well. It was one of my most strategic investments, buying a solid company at a discount because of a temporary financial crisis. What was the family's expectation at that time? According to the records, Jessica Reynolds was positioned as her father's heir. She'd worked there during college summers, got her MBA with a focus on family businesses, and told everyone she was set to take over the company. It was all starting to fit together in a very uncomfortable way. So when I acquired the company and brought in professional management, I basically eliminated her career path. More than that, you eliminated what she considered her birthright. James opened another document. This is where it gets interesting. I've been tracking some discreet inquiries into your investment activities. Someone has been asking questions about shell companies' acquisition structures and anonymous investors. A knot formed in my stomach. What kind of questions? Professional-level questions. Kind of research that suggests someone with business training and legal connections is involved. He turned his monitor toward me. Emily, I think your daughter-in-law hired a private investigator. The implications hit me immediately. 15 years of careful legal structures and deliberate privacy could be unraveled if someone was motivated enough. How vulnerable are we? That depends on how deep they want to dig. Your privacy structures are solid, but they're not impenetrable. A determined investigation with legal backing could eventually trace the ownership back to you. I thought about Jessica's attitude. At lunch, how she presented her findings like a chess player, revealing her checkmate. What would you recommend? Honestly, get ahead of it. If she's building some kind of financial claim or trying to appeal, to a sense of family obligation, you need to control the narrative before she exposes you. James leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. But Emily, there's something else. This goes public, it won't just affect you. Dylan's career could be compromised if it looks like his success was tied to a family fortune he didn't even know about. I hadn't considered that. Dylan's reputation was built on his own hard work. People knew his mother was a secret tycoon. They would question every promotion he ever got. It was a painful irony. I had hidden my fortune to protect him. And now that very secret could destroy everything he had worked for. There's one more thing, James continued, pulling up a final document. The Reynolds family's current financial situation is more fragile than it looks. They've been maintaining their lifestyle with loans, probably waiting for Robert to find another business opportunity or for Jessica to marry someone rich. And now she thinks she has. Exactly. But, Emily, if she's planning to ask for financial support or get involved in your investments, you need to be prepared. This is about to become more than just a family disagreement. When I left James's office, I realized I was facing the same choice Thomas and I had made 15 years ago. Only now the stakes were much higher. This time I wasn't just protecting my son's independence. I was fighting to keep everything I had built from being turned against my own family. That night I did something I hadn't done in months. I opened a bottle of fine wine that Thomas and I had been saving. I poured myself a generous glass and spread 15 years of financial records across my dining room table. If Jessica wanted to play investigator, she was about to find out she had picked the wrong person. The numbers told a story of patience and strategy. Thomas and I hadn't just gotten lucky. We were methodical. We researched every investment, diversified carefully, and reinvested our profits. Those initial $25 million grew to $50 million by 2015, then to $200 million by 2018. By the time Thomas died, our net worth was over $700 million, and I had continued to grow it. More importantly, I had been quietly building something bigger than just wealth. I had significant shares in a dozen different companies, held licensing agreements on 17 different technologies, and had invested in everything from renewable energy to biotech. I wasn't just a woman with money. I was deeply involved in the world of innovation in a way that even James didn't fully understand. My phone buzzed with a message from Dylan. "Mom, Jessica and I want to come over tomorrow night. She has some ideas about how our family should handle this new information." I almost laughed. Jessica had ideas. I could already imagine what they were. Something involving trusts and family board meetings with a more collaborative approach to my money. What she didn't understand was that I'd been managing expectations and protecting my interests for longer than she'd been alive. I pinned the legal documents James had given me on the Reynolds finances. Their situation was even worse than I thought. Their family estate was mortgaged to 80% of its value. Their investment accounts had been drained to maintain their lifestyle, and they had significant debts, all backed by Robert's belief that he would eventually cash in on his business contacts. Robert thought he had retired comfortably with the money from his company's sale. But the reality was more complicated. Much of his income came from consulting fees and board positions that I myself had arranged through the new management of Reynolds Holdings. His standard of living depended on me. But that was just the surface. I opened my laptop and started digging into Jessica's recent activities. If she had hired a private investigator, there had to be a trail. What I found was both fascinating and disturbing. Jessica had indeed hired a firm specializing in tracking corporate assets. She had also contacted a lawyer who specialized in family estate disputes. And most revealingly, she had been several new lines of credit in the last month, probably to finance her investigation with the hope of a substantial return. She hadn't just married my son for love. She had married him as an investment strategy. The wine was making me philosophical, or maybe just honest with myself for the first time in years. I had spent 15 years being the discreet widow, letting people think I was living a modest life while silently building something massive. But Jessica's little performance at the wedding had changed everything. I was tired of being underestimated. More than tired, I was done allowing it. Tomorrow, when Dylan brought his wife over to talk about her ideas for our family's financial future, I was going to give them a lesson on who exactly they had decided to investigate. 'Cause Emily Turner, the cautious investor, was about to become Emily Turner, the strategic opponent. And I'd been winning games for 15 years that other people didn't even know they were playing. Dylan and Jessica arrived at my apartment the next night with the air of diplomats approaching a delicate negotiation. I had prepared for them with a simple cheese and fruit platter and a moderately priced bottle of wine. Nothing that would give away my true resources. "Mom, thanks for sitting down with us." Dylan began, his tone cautious. "I know. The last few days have been complicated." Jessica was dressed in a sharp business suit. Her Wharton training was evident in both the folder she carried and the way she settled into my armchair. "Emily, I want to start by saying that everything we discussed tonight is for the family. We're all on the same side here." I almost laughed. "Course, dear. What did you want to talk about?" She opened her folder, revealing several neatly prepared documents. "Well, I've been thinking about our conversation at lunch, and I think we may have gotten off on the wrong foot. I'd like to propose a more collaborative approach to our family's financial planning." Collaborative? How? Jessica has some ideas about how we could structure things to benefit everyone, Dylan added, clearly uncomfortable. "The thing is, Emily," Jessica continued, "family wealth works best when it's managed strategically across generations. Dylan and I were talking about creating a structure that protects your privacy but also allows for more transparency in our planning." There it was. I took a sip of wine and waited. "We were thinking of establishing a family foundation, something that would allow us to make charitable donations, gain tax advantages, and coordinate our investments." She pulled out what looked like a preliminary legal draft. "I've already had some initial talks with a lawyer specializing in family wealth management." The nerve was shocking. She finds out I have money and immediately starts planning how to access it, complete with legal consultations and formal proposals. Sounds quite thorough. The foundation would be led by a board of family trustees. She continued, warming up. "Yumi, Dylan, and any children we might have. It would give us all a voice in major financial decisions." Dylan looked at the documents, completely overwhelmed. "Jessica, maybe we should slow down." "Actually, Dylan, I think your wife has put a lot of thought into this," I said calmly. "Tell me, Jessica, what did you have in mind for the initial funding of this foundation?" Her eyes lit up. "Well, I thought we could start with something substantial enough to make a real impact. Maybe around $50 million to establish credibility in the philanthropic community. $50 million from the woman who called me a family embarrassment less than a week ago. And the board structure you mentioned," I continued casually. "How would the votes be distributed?" "Think equal representation would be the most logical," she answered confidently. 3 trustees, 3 votes, very democratic." I set my wine glass down and looked her straight in the eye. "Jessica, can I ask you something honestly?" "Of course." "Do you love my son?" Question caught her completely off guard. She glanced at Dylan, then back at me. What kind of question is that? A simple one. Do you love Dylan for who he is, or do you love what you think being married to him represents? The silence in the room was thick with tension. Dylan looked between us, growing more nervous by the second, and Jessica's calm facade began to crack. I think it's unfair how you're framing our relationship. Is it? I stood up and walked to a bookshelf where I pulled out a folder I had prepared. 'Cause I have some information that might clarify things. I returned to my seat, opened the folder, and showed her the investigation report James had prepared. Her face went pale as she recognized some of the documents. This is a record of your communications with Aguilar. Private investigations over the last 2 weeks, I said evenly. Seems you hired them to research corporate ownership, structures, and trace anonymous investors. Quite expensive from what I can see. Dylan stared at his wife in disbelief. Jessica, you hired private investigators. It's not what it looks like, she said quickly. I just wanted to better understand the family's financial situation. You were building a case. I corrected her. These documents show you also consulted with Vance Peters and Associates, a law firm that specializes in family estate disputes and trust litigation. I pulled out another paper. This is interesting. You opened 3 new lines of credit in the last month, borrowing against a supposed future improvement in your family financial status. That's a pretty bold assumption. Jessica was unraveling. Her carefully constructed composure was gone. Emily, you have to understand. I was just trying to protect our family's interests. Whose interests exactly? I asked. Because according to this financial analysis James prepared, your family's situation is far more fragile than you've let on. I placed several more documents on the coffee table. Your parents' estate is mortgaged for nearly 80% of its value. Their investment accounts have been drained to maintain their lifestyle ever since your father lost Reynolds Holdings. In fact, most of their current income comes from consulting contracts that I arranged through the company's new management. Dylan scanned the documents, his expression shifting from confusion to anger and then to a deep, profound disillusionment. Mom, how do you know all this? 'Cause Dylan, when someone starts investigating me, I investigate them back. And what I discovered is that your wife's family has been living on borrowed time and borrowed money for the last 3 years. Jessica finally found her voice, but it was trembling. That doesn't change the fact that we're a family now. We should be working together, not against each other. You're absolutely right, I said, standing and walking to the window. We should be working together. I turned to face them both. Question is, what kind of work did you have in mind? Because here's what I think happened. You found out I have money and you immediately started planning how to access it. Not how to contribute, not how to help manage it, but how to restructure it so you would have control over it. That's not fair, Jessica protested. Isn't it? I pulled one last document from my folder. This is a recording of a phone call you had with your college roommate 3 weeks before you met Dylan. In it, you specifically mentioned that you're tired of dating men who can't offer you financial security and that you're looking for someone from a stable family with good long-term prospects. The silence that followed was absolute. Dylan was looking at his wife as if he was seeing her for the first time, and Jessica looked like she was calculating how fast she could run. Dylan, I said gently, I think you should ask yourself if the woman you married is really who you thought she was. But even as I said it, I knew this was only the beginning. Jessica Reynolds was not the type to give up easily, and I had just shown her exactly how much was at stake. So what happens now? Dylan asked in a low voice. I looked at my son, the man I raised to value honesty and hard work, and I made a decision that would change all of our lives. Now I said we find out what everyone is really made of. The next 2 weeks passed in a tense silence. Dylan temporarily moved back into his own apartment, telling me he needed time to process everything. Jessica had stormed out of my apartment that night, but not before making it clear she considered our conversation a declaration of war. And she proved to be far more dangerous than I had imagined. The first sign of trouble came when James Sullivan called me on a Friday morning. His voice was tense. "Emily, we have a problem. Someone has been making inquiries with the SEC about your investment structures. Professional inquiries suggesting they're building a case for some kind of regulatory violation." My stomach dropped. What kind of violations? Failure to properly declare beneficial ownership in publicly traded companies. Possible use of insider information. Questions about whether your shell companies properly reported their activities. He paused. "Emily, this isn't just curiosity anymore. Someone is trying to build a legal case against you." I knew exactly who that someone was. "How serious is this?" "Depends on what they find. Your structures are legal, but complex financial schemes can look suspicious to regulators. If they file a formal complaint, you could be facing months, even years of investigations, even if you're eventually cleared." The implications were overwhelming. Not just the legal costs, but the media exposure would destroy the privacy I had maintained for 15 years. "What do you recommend?" "Frankly, shut this down before it gets worse. Whatever family conflict is driving this needs to be resolved quickly because regulatory scrutiny has a way of expanding." I hung up the phone, my mind racing. Jessica had escalated from private investigation to all-out legal war, hoping to force me into a settlement. It was a smart if morally bankrupt strategy. My phone rang. It was Dylan. "Mom, we need to talk. Something happened." He arrived an hour later looking gaunt and older than his 32 years. Jessica filed for legal separation. He said it bluntly. Her lawyer says she's concerned about potential financial liabilities from undisclosed family assets. I almost admired her thoroughness by filing for separation. She was legally protecting herself while setting the stage for a divorce negotiation. "I'm sorry, Dylan. Are you really?" He looked at me with eyes that held more pain than anger. "'Cause it feels like you orchestrated this, like you wanted my marriage to fall apart just to prove a point about her intentions." The accusation hurt more than I expected. "Dylan, I never wanted your marriage to fail. I wanted you to understand who you married before it was too late. By destroying her family's financial stability and investigating her like a criminal," he shot back. "Mom, I don't even know who you are anymore." That stung, but I held my ground. "I'm the same person who taught you to value honesty and integrity. The same one who wanted you to succeed on your own merits, not because of family money. And look how that turned out," he said bitterly. "My wife is leaving me. Her family's finances are in ruins, and my mother is some kind of business tycoon who's been lying to me for 15 years. I wanted to comfort him like when he was a little boy, but the distance between us felt miles wide. Dylan, there's something else you need to know. Jessica has filed complaints with federal authorities about my investment activities. She's trying to force me into a public legal battle." He stared at me. "What does that mean?" "It means this isn't over. It's just beginning. And I need you to decide if you're going to stand with me or if you're going to let her destroy everything I've built to protect our family." The silence stretched between us. Finally, Dylan looked at me with what seemed like the beginning of understanding. "What do you want me to do?" The meeting took place in James Sullivan's boardroom the following Monday. It was me, Dylan, Jessica, her lawyer, Mark Vance, and her parents, Robert and Paula Reynolds. The air was so tense you could cut it with a knife. Let's be clear about why we're here. Mark Vance began smoothing his expensive suit. My client has discovered that Mrs. Turner has been concealing considerable assets while allowing her son's wife's family to suffer financial hardship. This suggests a deliberate pattern of deception that warrants investigation. James, sitting beside me, responded calmly. Mr. Vance, Mrs. Turner's financial activities are perfectly legal. Your client's recent complaints to the authorities seem motivated by personal animosity rather than legitimate concerns. Jessica leaned forward. This isn't about personal animosity. It's about family responsibility and transparency. Emily has been manipulating people's lives while pretending to be someone she's not. I finally spoke. Jessica, I have never manipulated anyone. I invested in failing companies and made them thrive. I kept my life private because I prefer discretion. Neither of those things is illegal or immoral. You bought my father's company and let him believe he had failed as a businessman, she shot back. Your father did fail as a businessman, I replied calmly. I saved his company and protected his employees' jobs. Under his management, Reynolds Holdings would have been bankrupt within months. Robert Reynolds, who had been silent, cleared his throat. Mrs. Turner, I appreciate what you did for the company, but you can't deny that you were strategic in hiding your involvement in our family's affairs. Strategic, yes. Deceptive, no. You never asked about my investments, and I was under no obligation to volunteer the information. Mark Vance pulled out a thick folder. Mrs. Turner, we have evidence that you used your financial position to manipulate several situations involving my client's family, the consulting fee payments to Mr. Reynolds, the timing of certain business decisions, even the investigation into my client's personal affairs. Evidence of what exactly? James asked. Of a pattern of control and manipulation, designed to maintain power over this family's financial future. I looked at the people in the room, people who thought they understood the game they were playing. Mr. Vance, let me be very clear. I do not control your client's family. I do not owe them money. I do not owe them explanations. And I certainly do not owe them access to my assets. But you do owe your son honesty, Jessica interrupted, and basic respect to your daughter-in-law. Respect? Cold calm settled over me. You introduced me as a family embarrassment at your wedding. You hired investigators to dig into my private life. You filed regulatory complaints to force me into a financial settlement. And now you want to lecture me on respect. The silence that followed was deafening. Dylan, who had been quiet the whole time, finally spoke. What do you want, Jessica? What will it take to end this? She exchanged a look with her lawyer, then looked directly at me. I want a formal family financial agreement. Something that establishes clear expectations and responsibilities for all parties. What kind of responsibilities? James asked. Mark Vance produced another document. We propose a family trust structure with shared governance. Mrs. Turner would contribute a substantial portion of her assets, approximately $15 million, to the trust, which would be managed by a family council for the benefit of all members. I almost laughed. The audacity. You want me to put my money into a trust controlled by a committee that includes the people who have been investigating me and filing complaints against me? We want a fair arrangement that protects everyone's interests, Jessica said. I stood and walked to the boardroom window, looking down at the street where people were going about their normal lives, oblivious to the financial war being waged 20 floors above. I have a counter, Proposal, I said, turning to face the room. Jessica, you have 72 hours to withdraw all regulatory complaints and cease all investigative activities. In return, I will give you a settlement that allows you and your parents to maintain your current lifestyle without any further interference from me. What kind of settlement? Mark Vance asked suspiciously. $5 million. A one-time payment. In exchange, you will sign an agreement promising to never contact me or my son ever again. The room went completely silent. Dylan stared at me in shock. Mom, you can't be serious. But I had just offered $5 million to permanently remove toxic people from our lives. And from the looks on their faces, everyone was beginning to understand just how serious I was about protecting what mattered. $5 million, Jessica repeated slowly, as if testing the words. To never contact Dylan again. That's right. Mark Vance was already doing the math. I could see it in his eyes. $5 million was more than his client could ever hope to win in a lawsuit and came without the risk of years of litigation. Mrs. Turner, that's a generous offer, but it seems designed to break up a marriage rather than solve a family conflict. Mr. Vance, that marriage was already broken. I'm just offering to pay for a clean break instead of a messy one. Dylan shot to his feet. Mom, stop. Both of you, just stop. He looked around the room with an expression of pure disgust. This is insane. We're sitting here negotiating the price of my marriage like it's a business deal. And isn't that exactly what it's been? I asked softly. He turned to Jessica, his voice full of a pain that broke my heart. Jessica, I need you to answer something honestly. Did you marry me because you loved me or because you thought I came from a family with money? The silence stretched for almost a full minute. Dylan, that's not a fair question, she finally said. It's the only question that matters. I watched my son's face as he waited for an answer that never came. In that silence, 15 years of careful choices, financial privacy, and silent protection, all crystallized into one single moment of clarity. $5 million. I repeated, looking directly at Jessica. In addition, I will arrange for your parents to keep their house and for your father to keep his consulting position at Reynolds Holdings. You sign papers and walk away from my family. And if I refuse, I smiled. And for the first time since this all began, it was a genuine smile. Then you get nothing. Your parents lose the house, your father loses his income, and you will spend the next several years tied up in lawsuits that will cost you far more than you could ever hope to win. Mark Vance was whispering urgently in Jessica's ear, no doubt explaining the absurdity of refusing. $5 million cash in hand versus years of expensive litigation with an uncertain outcome. I need time to think about it, Jessica said. You have until noon tomorrow. After that, the offer expires and you will face the full consequences of the complaints you filed. When the meeting ended, Dylan stayed behind. Mom, did you really just buy my freedom from my wife? No, sweetheart. I just gave you the information you needed to make your own decision. He was quiet for a long time. And if she takes the money, then you'll know exactly who she was and you can move on with your life. And if she doesn't, you'll still know who she was, and I will make sure she regrets ever trying to manipulate our family. Dylan looked at me with something that looked like a mixture of awe and fear. When did you become so ruthless? I took his question seriously. I think I always was, Dylan. I just never had a reason to show it. At 11:47 the next morning, Mark Vance called James Sullivan to accept the deal. By 5 p.m., the papers were signed and the money was transferred. Jessica took the $5 million and vanished from our lives as if she had never existed. Dylan filed for divorce the following week, citing irreconcilable differences. 6 months later, he called me on a Sunday afternoon. "Mom, I met someone. Her name is Sarah. She's a teacher and she has no idea you're rich." "How do you know?" "Because when I told her my mom lived in a nice apartment and drove a reliable car, she said it sounded like a woman who had her priorities straight." I smiled, feeling something in my chest finally unwind after all these years. "She sounds perfect. When do I get to meet her?" "Next Sunday." "But Mom, when we have dinner, can you just be the woman who taught me to work hard and treat people right? Can you leave the powerful businesswoman at home?" I laughed, realizing that after 15 years of hiding who I was, I finally understood the difference between being invisible and being private. "Course, sweetheart, but if it turns out she's investigating our finances, the deal's off." "Deal?" he said, and I could hear his smile through the phone. For the first time in months, the future looked exactly as bright as I had always planned it to be. After everything that happened, I discovered that the greatest wealth I had wasn't my investments or my hidden accounts. It was the chance to start over, to decide how I wanted to spend my time, my energy, and my name. For years, I had lived in the shadows, afraid of the world knowing who I really was. Now I understood that real power was in choosing how I wanted to be remembered. My first decision was simple. I sold the apartment where I had spent the last 15 years. It held too many ghosts. I moved to Santa Fe, a place that had always fascinated me with its art and history. There, nobody knew me as the millionaire, widow, or the difficult mother-in-law. I was just Emily, a woman who enjoyed walking through the farmer's market and talking to local artists. I also started a small, quiet cultural foundation. No press releases, no gold plaques with my name on them. I called it the Thomas Fund in honor of my husband. We support young engineers from Austin and Chicago who dream of patenting their ideas but don't have the resources. Seeing kids from humble backgrounds present their prototypes at international fairs gave me a satisfaction no stock dividend ever could. Over time, the rumors about my fortune faded. People in Santa Fe saw me as the lady who always came to the 8 a.m. service with a blue shawl, the same one who stayed after to hand bags of groceries to families in need. I liked that simplicity, that chosen invisibility. My relationship with Dylan took time to heal, but we got there. There were awkward dinners and painful silences, but when I met Sarah, his new partner, I knew it had all been worth it. Sarah hugged me like she'd known me forever without asking about balance sheets or companies. She just said, "Now I see where Dylan gets his way of listening without judgment." It was then that I felt the bond between a mother and son, though strained, was strong again. Christmas, for the first time in a long time, my table was filled with genuine laughter. No champagne glasses hiding social comparisons, just cookies, hot cocoa, and poorly sung carols. That night I stayed up late looking at the lighted tree and thought about how much Thomas would have enjoyed seeing our family free of masks. I won't lie, there are still moments when the shadow of Jessica enters my thoughts. I know that with $5 million she'll find another way to reinvent herself, maybe in another city, with another victim. But that's not my problem anymore. I learned that I can't save everyone, and I don't have to carry those who only see me as a walking ATM. Now my days are filled with simple routines: pottery classes, brunch with my neighbors, and occasional trips to support community projects. I don't need bodyguards or armored cars. I need peace. And you can't buy that with millions. The funny thing is, when I stopped hiding who I was, I also stopped being afraid. I'm no longer scared of someone discovering my fortune because I understand that the numbers in a bank account don't define my worth. What defines me is how I use those resources to transform even just a little the lives of others. A few months ago, a young student who received a scholarship from the Thomas Fund approached me with tears in his eyes. "Mrs. Emily, thank you. If it wasn't for you, I'd still be loading boxes in a warehouse. Now I'm in Pittsburgh finishing my engineering degree." That sincere gratitude was the real end to all the drama with the Reynolds family. Today I look back and smile. Yes, I was invisible for 15 years, but I learned that invisibility can be a strategy, not a sentence. And I also learned that the most elegant revenge isn't destroying the person who tried to humiliate you, but thriving in their absence. So here I am in my 60s, living in a town that smells of fresh bread and bougainvillea, surrounded by people who measure me not by my money, but by my presence. I finally understood that life wasn't asking me to be perfect, just to be authentic. And if anyone ever introduces me as the family embarrassment again, I have my answer ready. The real embarrassment is wasting a life trying to impress others when you could be spending it leaving a mark that actually matters. The story we tell is fictional, but it is inspired by real events. The names and places have been changed to protect the identities of those involved. We don't tell this to judge, but in the hope that someone will listen and stop to think how many mothers are suffering in silence within their own homes. I'm truly curious. If you were in my place, what would you have done? Would you choose silence to keep the peace, or would you dare to confront everything to reclaim your voice? I want to know what you think, because every story is a candle that can light the way for someone else. God always blesses, and I firmly believe that courage leads us to better days. Meanwhile, on the end screen, I'm leaving you two of the channel's most beloved stories. I promise they will surprise you. Thank you for staying until the end.